In the last days of April 1945, the famous American Army Rainbow Infantry Division arrived at Dachau Camp with the order of liberating the camp. Its commander, Major General Harry J. Collins, had heard some unspeakable stories about that wretched place and took it upon himself to save the poor souls that were imprisoned in the camp. What ensued was a bloodbath where disarmed Nazi guards were slaughtered both by the American army and the inmates themselves. Allies tried to hide this event, so it is little known. Months later, on November 1945, the trial of 40 of the surviving SS guards began. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which targeted mostly Nazi higher-ups, these men were the direct perpetrators of heinous crimes. Most of them met the same fate, which now lied at the end of a noosed rope. In either way, they faced the consequences of their actions against humanity. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. The bloody liberation of Dachau concentration camp, April 29, 1945. After receiving some disturbing intelligence reports, Major General Harry J. Collins, commander of the 42nd Infantry Division nicknamed Rainbow, coordinated a joint effort to storm the Dachau concentration camp in southern Bavaria. As they were approaching the compound, following the train tracks that ended there, they came across 39 railway boxcars parked just outside the camp. A nauseating odor emanated from them, and upon opening the boxcars, Collins's division found over 2,000 skeletal corpses. They had died of hunger the days before. Most of them were either naked or wearing light cotton pants during the worst part of German winter. Claw marks on the inside walls of the boxcars indicated that they did all they could to escape that cold, dark metal tomb. There was nothing they could have done to avoid their gruesome fate, however. One of the corpses reportedly had its head crushed, as if he desperately bashed it against the train walls to end his suffering more quickly. Dachau was the third concentration camp to be liberated by British or American Allied forces. They still did not know the extent of the horrors the Nazi camps hid. News about Auschwitz had been slowly making their way across the ranks of the American army, but most of the soldiers just could not believe they were true. Now they knew. Moving deeper into the complex, the soldiers found more bodies. Some had been dead for hours or days before the camp's capture and lay where they had died. They inspected the camp to find a row of concrete structures that contained rooms full of hundreds of naked and barely clothed dead bodies piled floor to ceiling. Additionally, they reported the existence of a coal-fired crematorium and a gas chamber. Around 300 guards remained in the camp, providing all the resistance they were capable of. In the soldiers' mind, these were the monsters responsible for crimes they had thought were unimaginable to a human being. Soon, the 300 guards surrendered to an angered and deeply disgusted mob of armed men. There was no way it would end well. The guards that saved their lives for the moment had left the camp earlier that week. The commandant and a strong guard forced between 6,000 and 7,000 surviving inmates on a death march from Dachau south to Eurasburg, then eastwards towards the Tegernsee. Any prisoners who could not keep up on the march, which lasted a week, were shot. Many others died of exhaustion, hunger, and exposure to low temperatures despite the end of winter being close. Months later, a mass grave containing 1,071 prisoners was found along the route. Some died due to the terrible conditions, but others who probably were too sick to walk were shot to death. The retaliation unleashed by the Americans on the camp prisoners is not well known. Our only source is the report by Lieutenant Colonel Felix Lawrence Sparks, commander of the 157th Infantry Regiment. This report is thought to be full of omissions and distortions, with the intention of protecting his soldiers. Sparks reported that as his company advanced through the large camp compound, the captured German guards were separated into small groups. One of them, comprising 50 Germans, was confined in an area of the camp originally intended for storing coal. Sparks left a small machine gun team to watch over the prisoners and make sure none tried to escape. He then proceeded with the rest of his men towards the center of the camp, where there were SS who had not yet surrendered. However, only a short while later, he heard one of the machine gun operators yelling that the Germans were trying to escape. This was followed by a round of machine gun fire and screams of pain. Sparks ran back to the site and found a 19-year-old soldier yelling profanities and firing non-stop against the prisoners. He had killed 12 Nazis and wounded several more. The gunner was reportedly crying hysterically, repeating that the prisoners had tried to escape. In his report, Lieutenant Colonel Sparks notes down that this was possibly the cause of the bloodbath, although it is rumored that some of his comrades dared the young officer to shoot the Nazi criminals without mercy. Bloodbath at Dachau, the prisoners' revenge. Despite the state of the poor souls left to die and rot inside the train carriages, Dachau was actually known for keeping its inmates in relatively good health. Of course, this was done on purpose so as to not damage the workforce, but it also proved counterproductive for the Nazis in the camp. The historic winter of 1944–45, which killed tens of thousands in Auschwitz and other camps, tested the endurance of the Dachau concentration camp's captive population. News had been coming all the time about the Allies' recent triumphs, which gave the prisoners hope. Adolf Hitler's Ardennes offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge, had been the last major German offensive in the Western Front. Although with some initial successes, the German army was unable to secure its objective of securing the port of Antwerp, which was still used by the Allies to disembark troops to an area dangerously close to the heart of the Nazi power. On the Eastern Front, things did not look well for the Nazis as well. The Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in mid-January 1945, moving in a diagonal line from Krakow to Breslau, and from there into Czechoslovakia. Prisoners at Dachau knew it was only time until either the Soviets or the Americans would capture southern Bavaria. As the weeks passed, confidence in Allied victory, while fragile, struck roots in Dachau. But as the winter progressed, the conditions at Dachau worsened rapidly. The SS's wanton cruelty incited new terror among Dachau's prisoners. Food supplies dwindled just as thousands of arrivals evacuated from other camps had to be fed. In short order, overcrowding, diseases like the deadly typhus and malnutrition followed the bitter cold of winter. Deaths in the camp soared. Dachau's final 4 months of operation in 1945 were catastrophic. Every month, between 2,600 and 4,000 inmates succumbed to disease or starvation. This is roughly 100 every day. With the camp suffering from a shortage of coal since late 1944, the crematoria could not keep pace with the tempo of dying. In response, the SS authorities at Dachau forced prisoners to bring the dead to a hill located close to the camp and bury them in a pit. The prisoners in the camp knew that they had to do something if they wanted to remain alive. In that context, rumors of the relentless advance of the Allies, who were almost reaching the camp, started to spread. When the Liberation Day finally came, chaos ensued, and some of the SS guards started to run cross-country to evade capture. Others concentrated in a small building with offices where they prepared to repel the Allies' attack. Prisoners, following the camp's liberation, swarmed over the wire trying to grab the Americans and hug them, happy to finally see the end of their suffering. For other inmates, the most important thing this day meant was revenge. They went for the SS men who had tortured them for the past months and even years. An SS officer was caught off guard without his pistol and tried to elbow some of the prisoners out of his way, but the courage of the prisoners mounted and they managed to knock him down. They did the same with other SS men, and in total they perhaps stomped to death a dozen of Nazis. Elsewhere in the camp, SS men, kapos and informers were beaten badly with fists, sticks, shovels, and anything the prisoners could find that was long and heavy. In one reported incident, it is claimed that American soldiers could not prevent a German guard from being beaten to death with a shovel. It is highly improbable that well-trained Americans could not do anything about it, so it is believed that they simply looked the other way. They must have thought that the guard deserved it, and that the Jews deserved their revenge. Another report describes how a barefoot, naked prisoner stomped on an SS trooper's face until there was only a wet pulp. Finally, an American chaplain reported that 3 young Jews found a man dressed as a peasant hiding in a barn. Immediately, they recognized his face as one of the most sadistic SS guards in the camp and beat him to death with sticks. The history of Dachau, from political prison to killing machine. Going back to the beginning, Dachau was one of the first camps in existence. It dates to February of 1933, just 2 months after Adolf Hitler had been named Chancellor of Germany by Paul von Hindenburg. In the last days of February, the Reichstag fire was used as a scapegoat for Hitler to claim special powers for himself. The Nazi dictatorship was beginning to take shape, and it was in this same month that Dachau started its functions as a place to house political prisoners. At first it was mostly communists, then social democrats, then Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and other minorities persecuted by the regime began to populate this prison, which soon became a brutal forced labor camp. Critics of Hitler's regime were quickly silenced by force. They were either killed or imprisoned. Estimates claim that more than 32,000 people would have passed through its gates and died in this piece of hell. Despite being a huge camp, Dachau was always overcrowded, as the regime had a passion for imprisoning anyone who dared to oppose it. Common prisons were flooded with so-called antisocials and common criminals, but the people that were sent to the camps were different. Not only did the regime seek to incarcerate them, but they were forced to undergo through an insane martyrdom if they had the bad luck as to being imprisoned in Dachau. The camp was originally intended to hold up of 10,000 prisoners. However, with the dizzying pace of political events and the increasing political and social persecution against any kind of dissent, Dachau quickly exceeded its capacity. It reached 65,000 prisoners on the days leading to its liberation. But 65,000 is not the complete number, as the majority within the walls of this hellish place died of malnutrition and painful contagious diseases. Others were directly tortured and killed by the guards. Others still died from illicit medical experiments. As times went by, Dachau became the model system for all concentration camps. The development of an efficient camp system and the main characteristics of each particular concentration camp were devised by SS Commandant Theodor Eicke, who served as Dachau's second commandant between June 1933 to July 1934. Eicke was a veteran SS militant who was 41 years old at the time and participated of the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, being one of the executioners of Brown Shirt Chief Ernst Röhm. Afterwards, he continued to supervise the camp system as the first concentration camps inspector, and even led a division during World War II, where he was killed in action in 1943. Notably, Dachau's main facility was located only 9 miles from the city of Munich, in the heart of Bavaria. Most of the civilians living nearby did not have a clear understanding of what was going on inside. Its inmates were forced to wear humiliating triangular patches of different colors, some of which are infamous as the famous yellow triangular patches worn by Jews. On some it could be read a P for Polish, on others the F for French, and so on. Nazis were obsessed with serially classifying their detainees. From 1937 onwards, SS officers decided to expand the camp, and it was the prisoners themselves who had to work on this construction and expansion work. The Nazis forced them to do this work around the clock, under appalling conditions, and so they constructed an enormous number of buildings in a little less than a year. On the other hand, Dachau was transformed into a forced labor camp to meet the demands of a war-oriented economy. This encouraged the Nazis to capture more and more prisoners to use as slaves. The purpose of Dachau during the war could be summarized in a German term meaning annihilation through work. The goal was to extract as much physical output from the prisoners as possible before they died. The guards woke the men at 4 a.m., and they could not return to their barracks until 9 p.m. They were assigned construction tasks, where they were forced to move huge blocks of stone with nothing but their bare backs for support. By 1945, tens of thousands of forced laborers had been worked or starved to death. Nothing lasts forever. The fall of Dachau. Heinrich Himmler anticipated the arrival of the American troops at the gates of Dachau by 2 weeks. In February of 1945, he sent a telegram to the current commandant of Dachau, Wilhelm Weiter, in which he warned that surrendering the camp to the enemy was unthinkable. The entire camp must be evacuated. No prisoner must fall alive into the hands of the enemy. Himmler instructed Weiter that if necessary, he was authorized to massacre the entire camp population with gas bombs. What had happened in Dachau was to remain inside Dachau. The world could never know. But Weiter disobeyed him. When the end was inevitable, Weiter gathered his administrators in his office and announced that Dachau would be handed over to the Americans through the Red Cross. He asked the SS officers to run to the clothing depot and begin dressing up as civilians and prisoners. While this scene was happening on the night of April the 28th, American General Lyndon was already at the gates of the main camp together with Major General Collins, and several hundred armed men. Only 130 armed SS men remained inside. Some of the Nazis had snuck out, others were hiding somewhere. Others had been killed during the previous 2 days while trying to defend some of the sub-camps that composed the Dachau compound. The last of the Dachau camps was the main one, where all the Nazi higher-ups were now trying to negotiate getting out alive. According to the negotiated terms, the gates of Dachau opened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the Americans were met by Dr. Victor Maurer of the Red Cross together with an SS officer. Maurer had a white handkerchief tied to a broomstick as Linden's jeep surrounded them both. Linden recalls that the first thing he smelled was a combination of burning garbage and singed chicken feathers. Then they began to hear voices coming from the wooden blocks. The voices multiplied, asking in desperation if the soldiers were American. They did so in different languages. The Linden men were nodding their heads in agreement. The prisoners went mad. They staggered out, some crawling, amputees and limping men running as fast as they could into the arms of the first American soldier who came their way. They felt that at last their hell was over. Now the hell of their executioners had to begin, and the Americans were ready to make the Germans pay for their crimes. There were more than only local political opponents and religious victims in Dachau. In wartime, it housed Allied pilots who were shot down by Nazi forces and later captured. American and British pilots were quite frequent prisoners of war in Dachau, and this was a well-known fact among the soldiers of the Allied side. These pilots were designated by the Germans as Terrorflieger or Terror Airmen. The Germans hated them as much as they hated the Jewish prisoners. The Dachau authorities argued that the Geneva Convention did not apply to criminals. Accordingly, the SS decided that they should regard pilots not as soldiers, but simply as ordinary criminals. On April 29th, when the 45th Infantry Division arrived at the gates of Dachau, they learned that the SS had executed one of their former comrades before some other pilots managed to escape from the camp. An SS officer and his adjutant took the pilot to a bomb crater. They threw him into the hole and shot him 5 times. The prisoner begged for mercy. He was wounded and on his knees and bleeding to death. But the Nazis shot him in the head and cruelly ended his life. The soldiers who heard this story from the prisoners were enraged and acted with fury against the soldiers they encountered in Dachau. Justice against the demons of Dachau. The men who entered this hell on earth called Dachau, unlike those who entered other concentration camps, had fresh memories of murdered civilians and wagon loads of corpses. The soldiers who first entered and liberated these poor prisoners who had been victims of the most heinous crimes against humanity ended up executing 17 unarmed Nazis. They did it because they were furious with what they had heard and what they had seen with their own eyes. The men in the so-called Rainbow Division believed they were stopping the spread of evil by physically eliminating those who had perpetrated these horrific crimes. But in doing so, they were engaging in war crimes themselves. Young, educated officers who were expected to set an example before their men were not immune to the horror they had seen. Nor was Lieutenant William P. Walsh of the Rainbow Division able to act rationally when he was confronted with the horror, seeing SS soldiers guarding and punishing people who had been tortured, amputated, tortured, and labor exploited to the brink of death. Walsh shot in cold blood every SS soldier he came across. Unlike Bill Walsh, who despite his crimes received the Distinguished Service Cross for his service in World War II, the Americans intended to judge the Nazi crimes with all the weight of the law. Only a week had passed since the liberation of Dachau, and already a debate was raging over whether or not to try Nazi camp officials. Some of those opposed were young interrogators who followed General Patton's logic, arguing that trials were superfluous, that the Nazis were all guilty and that all they could expect was death. There were others in favor of trials, and these generals cited the arguments of General Dwight Eisenhower. For them, Victor's justice contradicted the democratic principles for which the Allies had fought so hard. It was against this backdrop that Justice William Denson was appointed chief prosecutor at the Dachau trials. Denson, who would go on to fulfill the same role in regard to the camps of Mauthausen, Flossenburg and Buchenwald, argued that the trials were supposed to do more than punish the Nazi fiends. Denson believed that the Dachau trial would set a precedent. He believed in the creation of a record that could act as a deterrent to future Hitlers. Killing them without due process could create Nazi martyrs, and would give the deniers a chance to claim that they had been victims of trumped-up charges. There had to be a sobering and remorseless trial, but there had to be a trial. Denson decided not to use the Nuremberg charge of crimes against humanity, which only applied if the crime charged could be related to a broad pattern of crimes motivated by political, ethnic, and religious persecution. In contrast, the Dachau defendants had not themselves created this policy of extermination. Thus, they could not be effectively prosecuted by Nuremberg standards, but they could fall under the figure of common design. This was the judicial alternative that Denson discovered to make these criminals pay, and it was broad enough to catch everyone who had worked in any concentration camp and avoid restrictions commonly associated with the conspiracy charge. Only a week before the Dachau trial began, the Nuremberg trials had begun. The spectacle of the Nazi trials produced a sensationalist boom in newspapers and radios around the world. Denson was somewhat annoyed that journalism focused so much on the Nuremberg defendants, men who had caused suffering and death from behind a desk, neglecting those who actually pulled the triggers and gave the orders. He believed that the figure of common design could contribute as much to international law as the figure of the crime against humanity at Nuremberg. The truth is that for the media, these former locksmiths, mechanics, and peasants turned Dachau guards did not attract as much attention as the Nazi high officials on parade at Nuremberg. The trial, bloodthirsty butchers sentenced to death by hanging. 40 Germans who had worked on that hellish place called Dachau were prosecuted by Denson. They ranged from the last camp commandant, Martin Gottfried Weiss himself, to medical personnel such as Dr. Klaus Schilling and physician Hans Eisele, to guards, guard commanders, sergeants, and privates. They were accused of violating the laws of war while acting in fulfillment of a common design. In this way, they subjected their prisoners to various cruelties according to the definition of the law of war in the Geneva Conventions. The main trial took place between November 15th and December 13th, a time considerably shorter than in the cases of Nuremberg and Tokyo. It was labeled United States of America against Martin Gottfried Weiss et al. It resulted in guilty verdicts for 40 defendants. 38 of them were sentenced to death by hanging. The other 4 were given various prison terms ranging from 10 years to life in prison. It didn't take long for some criticism of Denson's judicial procedure to arise. These came not from academics and politicians, but mainly from the media. There were dissident voices in both Germany and the United States. The protesters claimed that German soldiers would be forced to sign confessions after being subjected to questionable interrogation techniques. These claims caused an uproar. There was a joint German-American campaign demanding the release of Nazi soldiers responsible for the murders at Dachau and other concentration camps. The campaign featured some prominent personalities from the moment, among them Bishop Aloysius Muench of North Dakota, who had been in frequent contact with the war criminals themselves and was a strong advocate of their release and a justifier of the crimes. The religious man claimed that the Germans had only done their duty for their country, but this was not going to stop Prosecutor Denson's determination at Dachau. Historically speaking, to say that the defendants did not receive an adequate defense or opportunity to defend themselves would be incorrect. There are hundreds of photographs, memoranda and testimony and other items presented as evidence by both the prosecution and the defense. This evidence was introduced, observed, and explained at trial and presented in court, as would be done in a trial against an American soldier under these circumstances. At the end of 1945, the psychologist Gustav Gilbert visited the Landsberg prison near Munich. There, the accused Germans awaited their sentences. This place was filled with symbolism, as it was the prison where Adolf Hitler famously wrote Mein Kampf. Gilbert had also been a prison psychologist before and during the Nuremberg trials, and he spoke fluent German, so he was one of the best prepared persons to evaluate the mental health of the accused. Apart from administering Rorschach and intellectual quotient tests to the SS officials, Gilbert used to walk down the prison corridors and eavesdrop on the prisoners. Later, he would publish the diaries of what he heard in Nuremberg, Landsberg, and other places. He claimed that the most bone-chilling experience he had during these years was that of watching the Nazis at Landsberg. The Germans assumed a very relaxed position, talking and laughing with each other across the corridor, seemingly unbothered by the fact that they were about to lose their lives. In fact, everything made it seem that they even enjoyed this moment. Others played cards, but all seemed to deny the fate that awaited them. The gallows. On May 28, 1946, 28 of the 40 defendants who had been found guilty in the first trial, that of personnel from Camp Dachau, were unceremoniously hanged at Landsberg prison. The month before, 8 cases had been reviewed and their sentences commuted. Denson never turned bitter over the reductions. The executioner's name was kept a secret, and the hangings were only witnessed by those who participated of the trials. Every man was taken to the gallows and asked to say their last words, many of which were simply "Heil Hitler." Then a black hood was placed on their heads, and when the order was given, the executioner pulled the lever. All of the hanged Nazis were buried in unmarked graves in the vicinity of the prison, although the exact location was never disclosed. Douglas Bates, the devil's lawyer. Very few of the Nazi criminals who stood trial at Dachau and elsewhere actually owned to their crimes. The most common strategy of the accused was just denying the charges against them. They either were untrue or it was not them. Others attempted to deflect blame from the man who carried out the crimes to their superiors by claiming that they were simply acting on orders given to them by their commanding officer. The American government soon realized that if this defense was allowed at a court of justice, it would unjustly exculpate almost all the defendants except Adolf Hitler himself, who was already dead. The government was quick to pass a provision within the charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg forbidding this type of defense. It was also applied at Dachau. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas T. Bates, who had fought in the war, was assigned by the government to have one of the most uncomfortable tasks in American military history. He had to exercise the defense of these 40 Germans. And not only that, it had to be a good defense. While the counsels for the defense had no doubt of the guilt of each of the 40 prisoners, they saw it as their duty to create the best defense possible. And while they knew this would produce friction in Dachau among the lawyers and their teams, from the start they tried to represent the defendants actively. This was simply the way it had to be as the world was watching. After the charges were read to the defendants, the tribunal president asked, "How do you plead?" The defense immediately requested to have the charges dropped due to their vagueness. The prosecution settled on the generic common design charge rather than crimes against humanity, which was the basis for the Nuremberg trials. Under the common design concept, organizations as well as individuals could be charged with war crimes. Membership in an organization was enough to convict an individual of a war crime, whether or not there was a witness to testify that the accused was seen committing any criminal acts. When the judge refused to drop the charges, Bates and his defense team encouraged their defenders to deny the evidence or to accuse their superiors. Finally, they prepared strong closing arguments. During the 4-week trial, they argued that the camp was set up and run under strict orders from Himmler and the Reich Security Headquarters in Berlin. Rations, clothing, medical supplies conformed to the standards set by their superiors. Bates and the defense argued that Dachau was a good camp in comparison to others. They provided evidence that some of the defendants were no longer in Dachau when their crimes were allegedly committed. Above all, the strongest argument was that they did what they were taught in the military code, to follow orders from their superiors. But Bates knew deep down he would not get his defendants acquitted. His strategy was to try to convince the court that orders weighed heavily in the actions inside Dachau, and that the prosecution's evidence was mostly hearsay and did not justify the death sentences. 2 weeks into the trial, witnesses had identified the defendants as the men who ran the camp, provided testimony of their atrocities, and linked each of them to specific crimes. Many of the witnesses, however, relied on hearsay or conversations they had had with inmates. If the Nazis who ran Dachau were to be hanged, more tangible evidence was needed. They needed their signed confessions, which they had obtained in the first days after their capture. The defendants' lawyers knew that discrediting these confessions might be their only chance. They wanted to prove that the confessions had been coerced. Densons was forced to acknowledge that his second-in-command and chief interrogator, Paul Guth, was a young, inexperienced man aware who conducted rough interviews. They knew that fear could sometimes uncover non-existent truths. But Denson proved that Guth was not violent. He did not like coercion. Still, the prosecution decided that the most important thing would be to show tangible evidence and records, and not rely on confessions that could be discredited or hearsay. Martin Gottfried Weiss, slaughterer of Jewish slave laborers. On December 10, 1945, the defense led by Bates called to the stand the most high-profile of their detainees, Dachau camp commandant Martin Gottfried Weiss. Weiss was a veteran of the SS camp system, having previously been commandant at the Neuengamme and Majdanek camps. So impressed was Himmler in his performance that he was promoted to camp inspector, the position that had first been held by Theodor Eicke, known as the father of the concentration camp system. Weiss and his family were proud of him and all he had achieved in so few years. So it was that Weiss became commandant of Dachau between 1942 and September 1943, replacing his SS colleague Alexander Piotrkowski. Before the Nazis lost the war, Weiss received his last promotion, Chief of Amtsgruppe D, the highest bureaucratic rank in the SS. It is noteworthy that the last commandant of Dachau, Wilhelm Weiter, knowing the fate that awaited him, decided to end his own life in Itter Castle in Austria on May 6, 1945. In order to avoid a strong sentence, Bates had an ace up his sleeve to say that conditions under Weiss were different than under Weiter, who could no longer defend himself because he was dead. But Denson soon dismantled this argument. Conditions in Germany had changed by the time Weiss arrived at Dachau. Labor was needed to meet the demands of a wartime economy, so inmates did not have to be killed, but they could be squeezed to death. Weiss knew that he did not have to waste this resource that was free to the Reich. But again, the sadism of the Nazis was stronger. Many witnesses testified that the prisoners worked the longest during Weiss's tenure, who imposed a minimum of 11 hours a day. Prisoners also received less food than with other commandants. For Denson, these deaths were part of the common design. Working them to death was as much a part of their plan as the segregation of the Jews, the systematic looting of their property, the illegal transports that brought thousands of people to die in the camps, the mass murders in crematoria, the transports out of Dachau, and those that brought prisoners to this hell on earth. Even the cannibalism that took place in some of these transports was all part of the same common design that sought the physical elimination of the so-called inferior races. Denson also noted that Weiss was involved in one of the worst massacres in Nazi history, in which 43,000 Jews were murdered during their harvest festival. The massacres in the Polish camps of Majdanek, Poniatowa, and Trauniki took place between the 3rd and 4th of November 1943. A day later, Weiss was sworn in as commandant to celebrate this achievement. As soon as he took command, Weiss assigned more than 600 Jewish women prisoners to clean up the remnants of the massacre. The women had to collect and classify the clothes of the corpses, move the bodies, remove their shoes and other valuables that would end up in the Nazi coffers, while the men were in charge of digging and burying the corpses of those who until recently had shared their cells. Some of them even had to dig the graves of their own relatives. The men who dug the graves would be killed shortly thereafter. They were pushed into the pits with the bodies they had just buried and shot. The women were sent to Auschwitz, where they were all gassed. After completing his task at Majdanek, Weiss was rewarded with yet another promotion, head of an office of the Economic Committee. There he developed a Jewish labor program to build fighter planes for the German Air Force, all with slave labor. That was the last position he held until he was captured by American soldiers. The abominable Dr. Schilling, deadly experiments in Dachau. Klaus Karl Schilling was a German physician specialized in tropical medicine. He was appointed to Dachau concentration camp in 1942 by the SS leader Heinrich Himmler to develop secret scientific research. It is said that Schilling, before falling into the temptation of the Nazis, was a respected scientist around the world who sought to do good. His obsession was to find cures for diseases that until then had not been available, such as malaria. That is why he accepted Himmler's offer to work in Dachau. For him, this camp meant having access to more facilities and resources than he could get from any other hospital in Germany in wartime, and it also meant more access to human beings to experiment on. It is at this point that his obsession with doing good turned him into an evil and ruthless scientist. Schilling could not avoid anything that was going on around him, but the fact that he kept attending there made him not only an accomplice, but a perpetrator of horrible crimes. He was obsessed and did not want to lose his human guinea pigs. Schilling wanted to go down in the history of mankind as the man who had saved the world from malaria, and this was also a form of propaganda for the Nazi regime, which was obsessed with demonstrating to the world the superiority of its scientists. The inmates at Dachau were subjected to cruel experiments devised by the cruel scientist. Victims were submerged in cold water to reduce their body temperature, and the time of their death was recorded, to test how long a human being could survive in freezing water. Other experiments included subjecting people to high altitude in pressure chambers. Another very common experiment was to use poisoned bullets to see what reaction this new type of weapon could have on the human body. They also did experiments with contagious diseases and others that were inspired in the work of the physicians at Auschwitz, for example with sterilization via X-rays. Thousands of people were sent to Dr. Schilling's cabin to be subjected to these cruel medical experiments against their will. A large proportion of them died in them, without Schilling even flinching or batting an eyelash. His coldness was comparable only to that of the notorious Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. Schilling's scientific team went from being involved in the search for a cure for malaria to far more cruel and less dignified pursuits, such as discovering a way to kill as quickly and expeditiously as possible. Killing easily and efficiently was Hitler's obsession, and he believed that science could be his best ally. Dr. Schilling, like 37 other defendants, was sentenced to death by hanging for all these inhumane crimes. Prosecutor Denson regarded him as a vital cog in the common design of Dachau. Gilbert, the psychologist, also visited him before his death. In that talk, Schilling came clean. He told him that he believed he had achieved nothing with his malaria experiments because he had been unable to obtain accurate reports on the causes of death of his human guinea pigs. He thought the experiments performed at Auschwitz, where men who were frozen to death were placed in a bed with a naked gypsy woman so that she could revive the man, were not scientific. His, however, were more serious. In May 1946, Schilling was hanged in Landsberg prison, and like the rest he was buried in an unmarked grave. His name did not enter the history of the great scientists who contributed to mankind, but the eternal ignominy of a sadistic and cruel Nazi scientist. Hanns Eisel, from angel to butcher. Besides Klaus Schilling, there was another outstanding non-military personality who was tried in Dachau, Hanns Eisel. Eisel was a very reputable and decent doctor before the war. During Operation Barbarossa, he was transferred to the Russian front. There he was wounded and transferred back in order to work in the concentration camps. Eisel's first appointment was to Sachsenhausen. The inmates knew Eisel as the Angel. This was because every time a prisoner came to his service because of illness or exhaustion, Eisel prescribed rest and rehabilitation and signed a certificate that released them from further work. This benign attitude had earned Eisel the respect of many inmates who believed him to be one of the few good Germans. Eisel had a humanitarian attitude. He made no distinction between Jews or Czechs and treated everyone equally. But everything would soon change. The Nazis began to view Eisel with suspicion and decided it was best to get him out of there. The course of the war and his transfer to Buchenwald and Dachau turned him from an angel into a demon. He enforced a policy of handcuffing his prisoners and once kept a prisoner transport without food and water for 2 days. In Buchenwald, they began to call him the Butcher. Like a mad doctor out of a horror movie, Eisel once had to treat the infected finger of a Jewish prisoner, but instead of curing it, he cut it off with a pair of scissors. The days went by in Buchenwald, and Eisel became more and more sadistic and cruel. Eisel went so far as to resecting the stomachs of prisoners while they were still alive, and he did it without anesthesia, just for fun and practice. Eisel was the son of a Lutheran pastor, but he had little mercy left in his heart. During his detention in Landsberg, Eisel wrote a defense letter entitled Audiatur et altera pars, which simply means the right of reply. In it, he denied all the accusations that the prosecutor had made against him. Eisel denied the amputations and punishments that the witnesses had described in detail during the trial. In other words, Eisel totally denied being the butcher that many prisoners described him to be. Eisel even had former members of the SS testify against him, and his situation was truly compromising. In the end, Eisel was unable to answer to the overwhelming new evidence that had been presented against him. While waiting to be sentenced, Eisel wrote a new memorandum in which he discussed the conditions in the Buchenwald concentration camp from his perspective. There he even blamed the communists themselves for being SS collaborators. The collaboration that some prisoners had exercised with the SS went far and wide, according to Eisler. His memorandum, however, is seen as a desperate attempt to escape the gallows. Eisel was condemned in Dachau for his crimes at Buchenwald, but was spared execution. 5 years after his conviction, he was pardoned by the United States government. In compensation, the province of Bavaria gave him a loan of 10,000 marks. The butcher returned to practice medicine in Munich. Finally, in 1955, new evidence about his experiments was discovered. The courts began to search for him again, but he managed to escape and settled in Cairo. There he set up a practice and was able to live quietly and guiltlessly for the rest of his life, with little left of his Lutheran teachings. He died in Cairo in 1967. Dachau meant hell for thousands of citizens who lived and went through situations unthinkable to most of mankind. Torture, slave labor, death by exhaustion, executions and scientific experiments were carried out on the prisoners. The Dachau trials conducted by William Denson set a precedent in the judgment of Nazi concentration camp criminals and murderers. They stood out for their ruthlessness. 38 Nazis, regardless of rank, were sentenced to death by hanging and were convicted of having participated in a common design. However, in the media, Dachau was in the shadows because the Nazi hierarchs were in the limelight at Nuremberg. There, towards the end of 1945, those who claimed to have only obeyed Hitler's orders were tried for the first time. The trials of Dachau were without a doubt a key event in which all those Nazis who participated in one of the great massacres of humanity finally met their fate.